Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Eric Fernstrom and Mr. Peter Flaherty.
Tom, thank you. Before I start, I just want to thank Dr. DeSalvo and Neil Levesque. All of you students are incredibly blessed to have the leadership and the wisdom of Dr. DeSalvo. The kind of thought and compassion he puts into everything in this school, I know about firsthand, and you guys are really blessed to have him as a leader. And Neil Levesque, I mean, you guys all know that by the time you actually start to the time you finish here at St. Anselm, especially if you're involved in the IOP, you will have met basically every political candidate that has ever even thought about running for president, and you're pretty much assured to meet firsthand the next president of the United States, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. So New Hampshire is the place, the whole joke about Iowa picks corn, New Hampshire picks presidents. Every presidential candidate has to start here. This is where the first test is. And so if New Hampshire is the place to see and the place to be, Neil Levesque is really the man to see. So Neil Levesque basically picks who the next president of the United States is. So you guys are really among great company, and you should really be thankful and grateful for that every day. Like Eric and I were joking around, religion and politics are the two things that you're never supposed to mention in polite company, but the reality is, if you watch TV, if you watch any of these debates, if you watch any of these campaigns, it's really all anybody actually does talk about is religion and politics. And Eric and I have had firsthand experience in 2008 and 2012, as well as some other campaigns, but the presidential campaigns that we did with Governor Romney especially, religion ended up taking center stage. So that's why when we're talking about, what are we going to talk about with respect to politics now in the age of Trump, you really can't do that without talking about religion and where we've come from and where we're actually going to go as far as even the next campaigns in 2020 and where religious or faith voters are going to go. Now, Eric, after the 2012 campaign, I think we'll start there and then kind of go back a little bit, decided to take an entirely different step in his career. You've heard about what he's done, a little bit about what he's done. But Eric decided to do what a lot of you people here at St. A's probably think is the unthinkable. He actually decided to go back to school after having just done and really been in the front row seat to this close winning the presidency with Governor Romney. And Eric decided to go back to school and explore his faith a little bit more deeply by getting a theology degree at Boston College. Can you tell us? And I'm going to be hearing this. Eric and I founded a consulting group together. We worked side by side together since 2002 with Governor Romney. And you all and I are hearing for the first time why Eric decided to actually go and get a degree in theology, because I've never actually had the guts to ask him about his personal thoughts. So,
well, thank you. So let me tell you what it's not. Okay, this is not a conversion story. I grew up in a Catholic family. As much as I love conversion stories, especially during Holy Week, this is not one of them. This is not a case of me sitting around in sackcloth and ashes doing penance for having lost a national campaign. That's not what going to theology school was about. In short, what it was is, we ended that 2012 campaign, and I was emotionally and physically spent. At that point, I had spent 10 years by Mitt Romney's side through a governor's race and 2 national campaigns. I was also presented with a diagnosis of cancer. So in my case, it was a combination of those 2 factors, being spent physically, also being confronted with your own mortality, as everybody is when they learn that they have cancer. I'm fine now, by the way. So I decided to take a step away from politics and explore how God operates in our lives, and also to deepen my own relationship with God. And I graduated last May, I'm proud to say. And I don't know what I'm going to do with that learning. I haven't been able to figure it out, although I would like to be of service to the church in some capacity going forward. But the whole experience for me was a good one. I'm sure some of you here are familiar with the writings and the teachings of Karl Rahner. He's a Jesuit theologian. And Rahner talks about an experience of God. It's something that is embedded in us. It's part of our programming. It's not a bug in our software. It's built into us. And it's what allows us to appreciate the transcendent. It's what makes the Gospels intelligible to us. It's also what allows us to have this self-communication with God. And so I've experienced that firsthand. Rahner says it generally comes out in liminal moments. These are moments that are lived in the extreme. So it could be an illness or a family tragedy, or you may have suffered the loss of a loved one, or maybe it's losing a high-stakes political campaign. But these are the moments when that self-communication with God takes place. So I experienced that, and I'm glad I did. And that, in short, is the story as to how I ended up at theology school at Boston College.
Well, it's great to know, and now I at least have the answer to a lot of the people. I remember when it was first reported, it was reported in the newspaper. Eric is kind of a hard-hitting, you want him in your camp. If you're a political candidate, or if you're an elected official, you want Eric to go to the podium and be your spokesperson. You always want him by your side. But I'll tell you, people came up to me afterwards and they said, "Oh my gosh, Eric Fernstrom's going to theology school?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Is he going to be a priest?" and I said,
"You'd be surprised at how many people thought I was on a ministerial track." So I don't know what the situation is at other theology schools, but at BC School of Theology, about a third of the student body are Jesuits in training. Another third are religious, and then another third are lay people like myself, generally mid-career people looking perhaps to change their career. And one thing I observed, upon graduation is that everybody answers to an authority except the lay people. They all know what they're doing. They've all been told to go back to school for whatever reason, or if you're training to be a cleric, you're there for a reason, and then your bishop tells you where you're going next. If you're a religious, a member of an order, you have an authority that you answer to, and they'll tell you what you're going to be doing next. Could be teaching at a high school, or maybe you'll go on and get a doctorate. But the lay people don't have that. There's no authority for the lay person. So a lot of the lay people that I did go to school with, like myself, are still in the process of trying to sort things out. Very much on our own, trying to figure it out. But that's one thing I observed about theology school generally.
Yeah, but it was interesting. It was helpful to me because people would come to me and just kind of close the door and say, like, I figured you would probably know. You're probably the closest to Eric. Do you think he's going to become a priest? And I said, well, actually, you might want to ask his wife and his two sons, and then reconcile that with the Pope, and then I'll get back to you. But one of the things, and it's kind of interesting for me to be here in this kind of setting to actually question Eric. We were back in the green room with Neil and Dr. Salvo, and I didn't want to blindside Eric. But one of the things that I did for Governor Romney with Eric's assistance was to prepare him for the presidential debates. And dating back to 2008 to all the Republican primary debates then, and then the 2012 Republican primary debates, and then 3 against President Obama. It was probably, I don't know, close to 50-something debates that we ended up having to prepare for. And for the general election, we didn't do it for the primary because there were like 500 candidates. But for the general election, Mitt wanted to do mock debates. And his preparation, I mean, Mitt really lives the aphorism, the separation is in the preparation. No one will out-prepare Governor Romney for anything. He also has the blessing to be, he has an abundance of IQ points to go along with his diligent preparation. So as a result, he usually does pretty well in what he does. But he really wanted to do mock debates before the debates with President Obama. We did, I think, 16 full mock debates with the red light, the yellow light, everything was perfectly replicated. And I always played the moderator for the debates. And Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, I'm sure he's been around here, he played Barack Obama, and he was fantastic. He played Barack Obama during the McCain Obama, so he knew Obama almost as well as Michelle Obama knew Obama. And I happen to know Mitt pretty well as well, every single one of his policy positions, everything he said about something in 2002, in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up. So I could actually pick up and say, actually, you didn't say that in 2010. I mean, Jim Lehrer wouldn't know that, and Candy Crowley wouldn't know that, and Bob Schieffer might not know, but I knew it. So I didn't want Eric to be put on the spot like that, so I kind of told him a little bit about where we were going, but if he does look a little bit surprised, it's not his fault. So I want to kind of get into where religion took center stage in the first presidential campaign that Eric and I were part of with Governor Romney. And Eric actually has written about this during his time at BC, which is the fact that Governor Romney would have been the first Mormon president. And Jack Kennedy would have been the first Catholic president, obviously, and became the first Catholic president. And he had to address the idea of his faith and how his faith, what kind of a role his faith was going to play if, in fact, he became the president of the United States, 50 years prior to Governor Romney having to wrestle with the same thing. And one of the things that Eric notes in his paper is that President Eisenhower once said that America's purpose is given meaning by a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is. But Eric and I both experienced something totally different, that when we went around the country with Governor Romney the first time, starting in 2007, people did care what his faith was, and they wanted to know a lot about what his faith really meant. And he was up against a pretty tough thing. I mean, I think there's 1.7% of the population is Mormon, whereas Catholics is 24%. So it's a little bit different hurdle than President Kennedy had. And so, Eric, could you just tell us a little bit about what President Kennedy, how he addressed the idea of faith in the public square, his faith, and what role it would play, and if it would inform his policy decisions, versus what Governor Romney did? And Eric and I had a little bit of a front row seat as to the formulation of Governor Romney's thought process and whether or not he was actually going to give such a speech, and if and when he did, what was going to go into it.
Yeah, so this is a Protestant country, and we had a Mormon running for president. When Kennedy ran back in '60, he was Catholic. There had never been a Catholic president. There hasn't been since Kennedy. And the way they answered questions about their religion were quite different. And I don't think people really fully appreciated how different Romney's speech was from the Kennedy model. There were superficial comparisons, but reporters didn't really dive into the two models for religion in public life that each represented. So for Kennedy, the way he answered questions about his faith was to completely disconnect religion from public life. This was a very separatist speech that he gave. Romney, in answering questions about his faith, emphasized shared values with other Protestants, things like love of family, the sanctity of life. And Romney welcomed a public debate that was informed by those values. So, two very different approaches. Romney was more accommodationist toward religion in the public square. Kennedy, for his own reasons, was much more of a separatist. And the country, I think, through the 8 years of the Obama administration, for the most part, followed that secularist approach that Kennedy put forward. With Trump, though, I think we're moving closer to the Romney model. Not that Trump in any way has the same moral character as Romney has, but Trump is much more accommodationist toward religion in the public square than the previous presidents have been, dating back to Kennedy. So I think that's what makes Trump unusual. It helps explain, I think, why religious-minded people stay with him despite all of his failings. You know, I don't like to argue with people about Trump's behavior, because I will stipulate that his behavior is appalling at times. It's sometimes immoral and unethical. It's definitely unconventional, unbecoming even of a president. But moral character, I don't think matters anymore for what we used to call values voters. In fact, there's an annual conference every year in Washington, D.C., Peter knows it well, called the Values Voters Conference. But they're not voting their values. What they're voting is their agenda, okay? So Trump can set a bad personal example, but he's reversed government policies on abortion. He has reestablished the right of conscience in healthcare. He's a true promoter of religious liberty. And he doesn't go around suing nuns who don't want to buy contraception. So this matters a great deal to people of faith. You know, as Catholics, as Christians, we're sort of taught by the fathers of the church that, as Paul says in the letter to the Romans, that we should submit to legitimate authority. Or, as Augustine teaches, we're just foreigners here in this earthly city. We should not expect perfection, that there is a greater glory, but it awaits us, and we're never going to realize it here. I think that conditions the Christian response to Trump, because Catholics for centuries, Christians for centuries, have lived with bad leaders. Some of them have been popes. Some people talk about Constantine, who did not set a good personal example. This is a guy who murdered his wife. He murdered his eldest son. He enslaved millions of people. It's a good thing we didn't have 60 Minutes back in the 4th century. But
Anderson Cooper would have had a blast with this guy.
But he ended the Roman Empire's persecution of Christianity. And for that, he was canonized as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. I'm not nominating Trump for sainthood, far from it. But I think there is a lesson there, that God can bring good out of bad. In fact, he's quite expert at it. Look what he did on Calvary. So when I think about Trump and I think about values voters, I think about how agenda matters more now than moral character. And in a way, I think Republicans have learned that from Democrats. Because when we had Clinton in the White House, and I hate the whole process of whataboutism, and this is not whataboutism, because I can go back further than Clinton. I can go back to Richard Nixon and his moral failings. But what Republicans learned from the Democrats during the Clinton era is that values don't matter. That what matters is the agenda and achieving that agenda. And faith voters are achieving their agenda. And as long as Trump keeps delivering, then he's going to continue to get their support, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we found, we had been through this exercise, like I was saying, in 2008 and in 2012, when we were trying to introduce Mitt outside of Massachusetts to the rest of the country. And when you go down south, it's, you know, it's a we're not in Kansas anymore moment a lot. And when we tried to sit down and talk to people from South Carolina, I'm not going to pick on any particular state, but I'm just throwing it out there. You know, the values voters had a lot of questions. They had a lot of questions about Mormonism, which is what led Mitt to finally say, you know, I'm going to probably address this substantively in a speech, kind of like Jack Kennedy did. And I remember Bob Schieffer had given, great man, he's been at this campus many times, I've been here watching him. He gave Mitt just an up and down grilling of the Mormon faith and doctrine after, you know, having said, oh, we'll just kind of touch on that just a little bit. And then at the end of it, he said, now at some point, are you going to address Mormonism in a substantive way? And he said, didn't I just do that? But no matter what interview or interviewer we faced, the end result was always, well, when are you going to give the speech on Mormonism and what it means to you? So ultimately, this was something that was just definitely going to happen. It's funny, Eric talks about the values versus an agenda. I remember, you know, some of the quotes that came from some of these folks in the very beginning of Mitt's presidential exploration. I remember Mike Huckabee, who was a rival at one point, said kind of offhand, like, well, I don't know Mormonism all that well. I think he was kind of getting into a car when they were doing a New York Times kind of profile on him, and he said, I don't really know much about it, but don't they believe that Jesus and the devil are brothers or something? I don't know. And all of a sudden they said, you know, Huckabee says that, so that's out there. And then after, you know, in 2012, when it looks like Mitt is the nominee and people have actually vetted him through 2 presidential campaigns, all of a sudden they say, oh, well, the agenda of Governor Romney is going to be friendly to people of faith. And so all of a sudden Mike Huckabee said, I don't care where Mitt Romney goes to church. What I care about is where he's going to lead the country. We also had experience with a lot of these national, I think Tom was saying in the introduction, I met with a lot of the national faith leaders and brought them together with Mitt on various occasions. One time in his home, very, very early on, before Mitt was even an exploratory stage in the 2008 campaign, we brought a lot of evangelical leaders to his home in Belmont. It's convenient for me, it was right up the street from my house, but Richard Land, who was the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, Franklin Graham, so obviously very outspoken, and Jerry Falwell Sr., God rest his soul, the founder of Liberty University, Jay Sekulow, who's now President Trump's only remaining attorney, it looks like, and a whole group of folks that we had a really good discourse on faith and politics, what it means, and quite frankly, what the doctrinal differences are between Mormonism and other faiths. And Mitt was there, and we were there for hours. And Richard Land, who is a genius by all accounts, didn't hold anything back, and nor did any of these great, just giants of the faith world. And it was great. And I remember that nobody seemed satisfied, quite frankly, but I think they were happy that Mitt was engaging in a discourse. And I remember that Mitt sent everyone a chair, not unlike these chairs, that was at that meeting. And in the back, it had their name, so it would say Jerry Falwell. You will always have a seat at my table. And he sent those out. I thought it was kind of a nice gesture. And then the years go on, and this really made me feel that Mitt had done a lot of hard work, and some of it did actually pay off. It kind of came full circle. In 2012, some of the people, for instance, Richard Land, some of those people who were questioning him and went through their own kind of evolution of acceptance of Mormonism, or acceptance of Mitt's shared values, quite frankly, that would trump doctrinal differences because of the fact, like Eric said, that it would translate into a pro-family, pro-faith, pro-religion of the public square agenda. Richard Land at one point was comparing Mormonism, it's no different from being a Muslim, and it's a cult. And then Richard Land in 2012, there was a headline that said, Mitt Romney, the right man at the right time, he has my vote. Billy Graham's website was comparing Mormonism to a cult, and all of a sudden it was like, Billy Graham's website takes Mormonism out of cult status on his website. So all of a sudden, all of these things seem to have come full circle, and it kind of culminated in Liberty University, which did not want Mitt Romney very close to the campus when Mitt Romney first decided to introduce himself as a candidate on the national stage. In May of 2012, the year that Mitt became the nominee, right after he became the nominee, he accepted one of the first things, and it was really defied really all political wisdom. He was extended an invitation to be the commencement speaker at Liberty University. And a lot of people would say, you shouldn't do that because you're now in a general election. But Mitt was so flattered, and I think he realized that his own faith journey and walking and talking with everyone in all of these different areas really kind of came full circle. And so he accepted it, and he gave a beautiful speech. I'm obviously a little biased. And Jerry Falwell Jr. Was there at the time, and he was obviously speaking. And he mentioned the meeting that had happened years ago in Mitt Romney's living room. And he said, you know, my dad sat down and talked to you for a long time, and you were nice enough to share and break bread and share all of your thoughts about Mormonism and Christianity. And he really appreciated that. And he really appreciated the fact that you were nice enough to, even though it looked like he wasn't going to be on your team, sent them that nice chair. And it said, you'll always have a seat at my table. He said he had that in his office, and it's been in his office ever since. And he said, and Mitt was sitting in a chair like this, and he said, when you go home, I want you to bring the chair that you're sitting in. And on the back of it, it says, Governor Mitt Romney, commencement speaker at Liberty University, whatever the date is, you will always have a seat at our table at Liberty University. And I thought that that was really a nice journey that Mitt had taken, and quite frankly, that religion and kind of religious pluralism had taken through the years from what we saw in the early stages of 2008 through 2012. And then in 2013, you saw probably one of the most diverse Congresses elected, whether it was Hindus, Buddhists, Mormons, that in the history of the Congress. So I think, like Eric said, we have really kind of come to the point where people are more accepting of different strains of faith, but I also think that we're facing the reality that as far as values versus agenda, I think people are really much more interested in, is this person going to be able to execute and implement the agenda? Which brings us to Trump again. I mean, if you could talk a little bit about what you think Donald Trump's faith journey has been.
Well, yeah. So he's a mainline Protestant, which is the faith of his mother. He is not a regular churchgoer, but he goes on occasion. He went during his inaugural. He goes during holidays like Christmas and Easter, I presume he'll go. I mean, I'm not going to make any prediction, but we can guess. He is a devotee of Norman Vincent Peale, who is a now dead Presbyterian minister. He is known for his teaching about positive thinking. In fact, he wrote a book called The Power of Positive Thinking. And it blends faith in Christ with having positive thoughts. That if you can imagine yourself doing something, winning something, then you can actually go ahead and do it. Which seems to fit the whole Trump psychology fairly well. The religion that matters, though, to the American people is not his casual acquaintance with Presbyterianism. The religion that I think matters, and which he has been able to master, is our civil religion, which is this sacralized form of patriotism that we expect our commander-in-chief to be expert in, to be facile with. And so I remember watching his State of the Union speech last year, and there had been an incident involving a Navy SEAL named Brian Owens, who died in a raid on an Al-Qaeda base camp in Yemen. And Trump talked about that man's death in that State of the Union speech in exactly the way you would expect a president who is steeped in our civil religion to talk about it. He said his name was etched in eternity. He talked about how there was no greater act of love than laying down your life for your friends. And it struck me then that he's got it. You know, for all of his fumbling during the campaign, for all of his bluster, he's been able to figure out that he is the high priest of America's civil religion. He has mastered that. And as long as he has that going for him, then I think he's in a good place as far as the expectation of the American people and in the performance of his responsibilities and duties as president. That's what I think really matters, not whether he's a weekly churchgoer. Like most Americans, he's not. So I'm not a person who doubts that he's a person of faith. He's a prosperity gospel follower. In fact, one of the evangelicals around him is Paula White, who is a televangelist, who's a prosperity gospel preacher. Makes sense. Norman Vincent Peale, Paula White. This is the tradition that he comes out of. So it's not correct to say he's not a religious person. He is nominally a Presbyterian, and he's baptized. He made sure his children were baptized. One of them converted to Judaism. But there's no question that he's acquainted with the Bible, even though he can't name his favorite passage. He knows the book. But it's not that side of him. It's not that aspect of him that matters for the office he holds. It's the fact that he is, as I said, the high priest of America's civil religion. He gets that role, or at least the people around him get that role. And he's able to perform up to the American people's expectations.
And the other people that seem to get the fact that that President Trump and then candidate Trump actually got that role as the high priest of civil religion were the voters. And you'd be surprised, you probably wouldn't be if you've read any exit polls, but just to go back to the journey that we all took with Governor Romney and the multi-year evolution and introduction to all of the national faith leaders and all of these giants in the faith world, you know, Governor Romney ended up winning the evangelical vote 78-21, which was the exact same spread that George W. Bush won the evangelical vote, believe it or not, 78-21. And George W. Bush is an evangelical Christian. George W. Bush, when asked by Tom Brokaw during a debate, who was your favorite philosopher, his answer was Jesus Christ, without skipping a beat. And you could tell that was in his heart. That wasn't in a briefing book. And so for Governor Romney to match that spread was pretty darn surprising to people who were having those conversations in 2007, 2008.
But then Trump did better than
but then Donald Trump.
Than Romney or Bush.
78-21 is George W. Bush. 78-21 is Governor Mitt Romney, and everyone's high-fiving each other. Donald Trump won the evangelical vote 81-16. And no one would have ever thought it. And just a couple of other numbers while we're on that, the high priest of the civil religion. With respect to the Catholic vote, Donald Trump, President Obama beat John McCain in the Catholic vote 54-45. We knew there was some work to do in Governor Romney's campaign for 2012. We worked very, very hard. And we had a real strong get out the vote, and the Catholic voters were so strong and passionate, and we narrowed that gap. But we still lost the Catholic vote to President Obama, 50-48. So we made some ground. Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in the Catholic vote, 52-45. And when it comes to Hispanic Catholics, Obama beat Mitt Romney 75-21. It wasn't even close. Donald Trump actually narrowed that gap, despite what he had said and some of the incendiary things that were said on the campaign trail. He lost, of course, he lost the Hispanic Catholic vote, but 67-26. He made up 13 points. Donald Trump did. And with white Catholics, Trump and Clinton, Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton with white Catholics 60-37. To put that in some context, he got more Catholic votes than George W. Bush, John McCain, and Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was the one that topped them out. He had 59%. Donald Trump had 60% of the white Catholic vote. And to put that in even more perspective, he got more evangelical votes than the evangelical himself, George W. Bush. He got more white Catholic votes than John Kerry, who was a white Catholic. John Kerry got 43% of white Catholics. Donald Trump got 60%. So there's something there. And so for people to say, oh, I don't know, Donald Trump did this, Donald Trump did that, I saw this on 60 Minutes, I think people might be fooling themselves if they think that Donald Trump is going to lose his solid support among faith voters, just if you look at those numbers.
So could I just interrupt? So this gets us to another reason why Trump does so well with religious voters. As you just heard Peter say, he did better than Romney and George W. Bush among evangelicals, among Catholics as a whole, among white Catholics, even among Hispanic Catholics. He did better than the two previous Republican nominees. There's a reason for this. We've talked a little bit about how moral character doesn't matter anymore. Thank you, Richard Nixon and JFK and Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. It just doesn't matter anymore. Agenda is what matters. We've talked a little bit about how Christians are sort of conditioned to accept government authority so long as it's legitimate and they provide some degree of order and justice, and certainly they do that here in the United States. But there is a third reason, and the third reason is, where else are faith voters supposed to go? I don't know if any of you caught it, but Cardinal Timothy Dolan wrote in the Wall Street Journal on Friday about how the Democrats have shut their door to Catholics, and over two issues. the life issue, and the fact that Democrats have abandoned poor and middle-class students in our Catholic schools. They are more beholden to the institutionalized public school bureaucracy and the teachers' union than they are to the whole concept of choice and letting parents decide where they want their children to go to school. And what was extraordinary for me about that op-ed was not that the Cardinal Archbishop of the second largest Catholic archdiocese in the country wrote it, as remarkable as that was. It's that there was no response from the Democrats. You would think that the chairman of the Democratic Party would say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. I would like to get my own op-ed in the Wall Street Journal arguing against what Cardinal Dolan wrote. Or maybe just send in a letter to the editor and say, hey, I object. There is a home for Catholics in the Democratic Party. But he didn't do that. And there have been very few Democratic voices raised to object to what it is that Cardinal Dolan said. So this is a problem for Democrats. It also occurred to me that when Trump ran, he did what candidates do if they want to get the Catholic vote. He put together a big advisory board. There were over 20 people on it. He had a couple former ambassadors to the Vatican serving on his advisory committee. What did Hillary Clinton do? Nothing. No advisory committee. She appointed Tim Kaine as her vice presidential running mate. But Tim Kaine is wrong on all those issues that Cardinal Dolan talks about. So until the faith voter is given a home in the Democratic Party, or there's a third, we don't have a history of Christian Democratic parties, small d, in this country. They do in Europe, but we don't have them here. But until there's a viable alternative for Catholic voters, for faith voters generally, then they're going to stay with the Republican Party, whoever the titular head is. And I think that's something that Democrats need to puzzle over and think about if they really want to reclaim the religious voter in 2020 and beyond.
And one of the things that Cardinal Dolan talked about in the op-ed was, he says, how times have changed because the Catholic vote used to be firmly in the Democratic camp. He remembers his own grandmother, he talks about in the op-ed, who whispered to him, just so you know, Timmy, we Catholics don't trust Republicans. And like he said before, I mean, there's really no place for them to go. I mean, a Ray Flynn type Democrat, Ray Flynn, the former ambassador to the Vatican, Boston guy, he's spoken here in the past, a good friend of St. Anselm. There's not much room for a Ray Flynn Democrat anymore. And it's funny because they wanted to. I was looking at a couple of the Trump headlines. They wanted to say that Trump was just going to have a terrible, terrible problem. In August, right before August of 2016, huge headline in the Washington Post: Donald Trump has a massive Catholic problem. And then your next headline is how the support of Catholics helped Donald Trump's victory. And so you ask, what the heck happened in between August and the election? A few things. One, Donald Trump was not afraid to talk about the life issue. A lot of candidates look at that as the third rail, and they're prepared to answer it in a debate if, God forbid, they're asked about it. But they're not going to proactively bring it up. Donald Trump, in one of the debates, just hammered away at the issue and talked specifically about partial birth abortion. And what he did, I thought, very effectively, was instead of kind of succumbing to the narrative that the war on women, the war on women, the war on women, Donald Trump, as he is wont to do, just went on offense And he said, you want to talk about an extremist? You want to talk about who's an extremist on this issue? There's one extremist on this issue, and it's not me. It's this woman right here. And he talked about partial birth abortion, and he talked about how gruesome it was. And I think you saw the Catholic vote change pretty quickly after that. And there are a couple of other things. So the WikiLeaks, all of the disparaging things that were said by high-ranking officials in the Hillary Clinton campaign, I don't think that was lost on a lot of Catholic voters, a lot of independent Catholic voters. So I think those were a couple of things that probably changed what was going on. And the other thing was the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court and the prospect of Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton shaping the Supreme Court, I don't know if you agree, that was a big issue too.
Yeah, it was huge. Of course, we had a vacancy on the court during that election year, and the Congress was not going to be moving forward with the Obama nominee. And so faith voters knew that this was all the marbles. It all connects back to Roe v. Wade, putting Gorsuch on the court. And Trump put out a list. This is in the midst of the campaign. This is never done. But he put out a list of potential nominees. And he said, my next pick will come from one of these folks. And I think that was highly effective because every one of the potential nominees on that list was a good conservative jurist. So that's another reason for trading agenda for values. Going into the voting booth, I think for the faith voter, it was a very simple calculation. You think about Donald Trump. I don't agree with him on his values, but I agree with him on the agenda. You think about Hillary Clinton. Well, I don't agree with her on her values, and I don't agree with her on her agenda. So it wasn't that difficult a decision for faith voters to pull the lever for Donald Trump. In fact, it makes a lot of sense for them to do it. As bad as he is in terms of his personal conduct and the way he conducts himself on Twitter, his tone, his temperament, as bad as that is, he has delivered for religious voters. And if he continues to deliver, then I think he'll continue to get support. Do you know? I don't know if any of you went to a Trump rally during the election year up here. I went to one, and the line that got the loudest applause was, "We're going to say Merry Christmas again." And he would say this in July. We're going to say Merry Christmas again. And the crowd would go crazy. So I think he knew exactly who he was appealing to and the language that would connect with those voters. Very, very smart. The media scoffed at it. They laughed. They thought it was ridiculous. There's no debate. You can say Merry Christmas to whoever you want. But Trump knew what was on the minds of these voters. And this is a coded way of communicating that I know there's a culture war going on, and I'm on your side. I want to be an accommodationist. I'm not a separatist. I'm not even a secularist. I'm with you. And that was very powerful. And I think that explains his performance in all those different religious categories that we have.
Yeah, and I don't think, I think we can all agree that Donald Trump broke pretty much every rule that could be broken when it comes to conventional presidential campaigning, especially in this state. In this state, everybody, this is hand-to-hand stuff. It's the whole, everyone's heard the joke about, what do you think of, candidate Stephen DeSalvo? It's like, well, I don't know. I've only met him 5 times, and so for Donald Trump to kind of parachute in and out of New Hampshire, everyone's like, well, that's not going to work. I mean, he's got to come down. He's got to do politics and eggs a few times. He's got to go here. He's got to go to diners. But no, I mean, he didn't do that. But I mean, he would shake everything up, broke every rule. He was a total reformer. He was an outsider's outsider. And that kind of, I mean, that was kind of a worldwide phenomenon too, as far as being an outsider, someone that is not going to be conventional. I mean, I'm not going to call on anyone because I remember how nervous I used to get when people would call on me, especially in law school. So I'm not going to call on any of you guys. But I'm just going to ask you who you think I'm describing here. When people wrote the following about this person, it should be an easy answer, so don't be shy. His style is so different from the piercing intelligence or the philosophical theatricality of his predecessors that it is almost jarring. He is at once blunt and simple, much like those receiving his message. And in a speech to millennials, this person said, "I want a mess. We knew there would be great disorder, but I want trouble." And before this man started that speech, he said these words. He said, "They wrote a speech for me to give you, but speeches are boring." He began to loud cheers from the audience. Who am I describing? Who said that? Pope Francis. Pope Francis. So Eric and I talked about this a little bit before as we were kind of thinking about what we were going to say about Pope Francis and President Trump. I mean, I think people remember in the campaign trail, Donald Trump got in a fight with everyone. Of course he was going to get in a fight with Pope Francis. It was just what day was it going to happen? So it came around the wall. It actually was Pope Francis who came out and said, "Hey, you're talking about walls. That's not very Christian." And then Donald Trump, do you have any response? Of course, Trump is like, "I think the guy's disgraceful. The guy's a joke or whatever. He's a clown." I forget exactly what he said about Pope Francis, but they didn't start off on the right foot, put it that way. But when Eric and I were talking a little bit about this, Eric was actually the one who brought it up. He said, Pope Francis and Donald Trump have a lot of similarities, actually. And Eric got me thinking, and that's when I started to do a little bit, and when I found that description of Pope Francis, I said, that's like describing Donald Trump. So tell us a little bit more about what you mean about the similarities
well, obviously
of Trump and Pope
more
Francis.
Differences than similarities, but the similarities I think are worth noting. So they're both reformers. They're both anti-bureaucracy, rejecting conventional norms. They are like two similar agents of change. Both of them have problems within their own body of faithful. Trump has in the Republican Party a faction of never-Trumpers who have just not gone away. The Pope, of course, has factions of critics who disagree with his leadership, but they're both soldiering on. They're both continuing to shake up their respective worlds. And again, I think there are more differences than similarities between the two. But it's interesting to note that temperamentally, no, not temperamentally, it's interesting, superficially, there are similarities between the Pope and the President. And as much as we focused on that disagreement they had about the wall and about immigration, the Pope received him at the Vatican. Melania was there, dressed very traditionally. We have a new ambassador at the Vatican in Callista Gingrich, who, by all accounts, and I know she faced some skepticism going into that position, She has performed her job ably. So there's room there for those two world leaders to continue to improve on their relationship.
And I know, Neil, you want to open it up for some questions, but I just wanted to just touch on one other thing when it comes to faith voters. And is President Trump and the United States under President Trump in the relationship with Israel? And what do you think of Donald Trump presidency has done so far with respect to the Middle East and specifically the relationship with Israel? And what do you think we can look to in the future, and do you think it will be a positive development?
Well, this is interesting because in those categories of religious voters, we didn't talk about the Jewish vote. Now, Jews did not vote for Trump in big numbers. I think it was about 25% of American Jews voted for Trump. And generally, he's not popular among American Jews. Israeli Jews love the guy. Absolutely love him. He was the first president to visit the Western Wall while in office. He declared that we would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. By the way, everybody, Democrat and Republican, campaigns on that. And then when they get into office, they're convinced, well, maybe this is something that you want to put on the back burner. Trump did not put it on the back burner. So he made that a reality. They're now building a new embassy in Jerusalem. What that means for the peace process, I'm not sure. Because as much as Israeli Jews like Trump, the Palestinians dislike him. And they see his thumb on the scale in terms of future peace negotiations between those two parties. So I'm not sure what to expect out of Trump's relationship with the Israeli government. My guess is the two sides to that disagreement are going to continue to be at loggerheads. I don't think America's role has been enhanced by some of the things that we've done. I think a conservative Israeli government might use Trump's expressions of support as license to do whatever they want in terms of reclaiming land for themselves. But as far as our relationship with the Israeli people and with the Israeli government, it's never been stronger.
And you make a good point about President Trump, and people, will see what the media is putting out there on a day-to-day basis, really an hour-to-hour basis at this point with respect to the comings and goings and the political theater, especially the political theater.
Oh, could I just also add, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Our relationship with Israel is a big checklist on the evangelical report card. They keep track of that stuff for obvious reasons. Catholics, not so much. Evangelicals are very interested in the future of Israel and the fate of Jerusalem. It matters to them. And I think that is another reason that accounts for Trump's support among evangelicals.
Yeah, and my point was going to be that people are keeping score. So as much as people will see the day-to-day and the hour-to-hour political circus that is the White House and everything surrounding it and all of the kind of comings and goings, the voters and the people that we were just talking about that make up those really mind-blowing numbers that we just talked about, they'll see through a lot of that. Just ends up becoming white noise, and they're going to look at his record and see exactly what he did and whether or not he actually stepped up and delivered on the things that he said he was going to deliver on. Eric makes a great point. A lot of candidates will say a lot of things to voters and say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and when they get in there, they're a little cautious, and they say, well, now I'm in, and now I've got to run for re-election. Donald Trump couldn't care less about, quite frankly, what people think about what his next move is, as long as he thinks it's the right thing. And he has done that so far on, like Eric said, with respect to Israel. He's certainly done it with respect to the Supreme Court. he's delivered the same way that he would. It was an ingenious move to say, these are the list of people that I will pick from for the Supreme Court. Never been done before. It was a great idea, and he delivered on that. Neil Gorsuch was one of the people he talked about in such favorable terms. And also with respect to the pro-life community. He stepped up like in ways that no other president really has since Ronald Reagan with respect to defending the sanctity of human life and the rights of the unborn. And that's not lost on the pro-life community. And the pro-life community is a very strong constituency, and they vote. And it's not just Republicans, and it's not just independents. It's also those people that Cardinal Dolan is trying to bring back into the fold, which is conservative Democrats. So I think people who dismiss Donald Trump's agenda, who dismiss his presidency, and who dismiss his re-election prospects should probably take a little bit closer look at the political science of it all before they do that. We'll get into the questions, but one of the things that I wanted to talk about when we talked about Pope Francis and Donald Trump's similarities, obviously, I think there were probably, I agree with Eric, probably more differences between Donald Trump and Pope Francis than there are similarities. Because, and I think we can end it with this, because when he talked about make a mess, I want you to make a mess and create disorder, Donald Trump might leave it at that. I don't want to take Pope Francis out of context. Pope Francis went on to say at the end of this speech, make a mess, sure, make a mess, but then also help to tidy it up. A mess which gives us a free heart, a mess which gives us solidarity, and a mess which gives us hope. And that's probably a good message to leave it on